Okay, today we're going to start our look at moral philosophy. And the reason why we're doing this is because if we want to eventually be able to say that certain actions made by media professionals are either ethical or unethical, then we need to have some basis for being able to say that. And of course, the basis for being able to say that is by learning more about moral philosophy or learning more about ethics. So we're going to be taking a look at different moral philosophies, different ethical theories. And we're going to begin today by talking about deontological ethics. Now, deontology is one branch of moral philosophy. And deontology deals with the whole idea that when it comes to right and wrong, there are some things that are inherently right, and there are some things that are inherently wrong. And those things that are inherently right or are inherently wrong then become for us a moral philosophy, really. And so there are a number of philosophers who are deontologists, and we're going to take a look at them today. But before doing that, what I thought I would do is just to go over and review for you one of the things that these philosophers adhere to that involve reason and will. Because you're going to hear me talk a lot about that today, about reason and will. And I thought I would just take a few minutes to talk about what we mean by that. And so what we're going to do is talk about the capacities of the human mind and explain more about what that involves and use that as a starting point for us. So again, we're going to be taking a look at deontology versus another stream of ethical thought, which is teleology. And what we're going to find out, as I said, is that deontology bases or determines good based on the goodness of particular actions. Now you might be wondering, okay, well, what amounts to good here? I mean, if something is inherently good, well then how do we know it's inherently good? Well, we'll find out more about that a little later, but in some sense, goodness is really measured by something being reasonable. Reasonableness. In other words, something is good if it appears to us to be reasonable. And we're going to be talking more about that here in a little bit. Teleology, on the other hand, takes a different look at good. Teleologists determine good based on the outcomes of actions. So in that sense, some look at teleology as being what's referred to as consequentialist, meaning that it is concerned with consequences. Whereas deontology really isn't. I mean, in some sense it is, indirectly, but it's more concerned with the actions that lead to consequences and the goodness of those actions. So earlier I mentioned that we're going to be taking a look at will and reason. And I wanted to explain more about that. Now what I've got up here is just a diagram of a brain. And much of what we're going to be talking about now comes to us courtesy of Aristotle. And really, it was talked about well before Aristotle. Plato certainly talked about it before Aristotle, but it was really Aristotle who really wrote extensively about it and thought extensively about it. So we're going to be crediting him with all this. But this really becomes the basis for teleological philosophy. And so what we're going to be getting at here is this. Aristotle tells us that the human brain is comprised of two distinct capacities: will and reason. And these capacities interact with one another really constantly. Every moment of our waking day, reason and will are interacting with one another. Now, each of these capacities, will and reason, have different functions for us. And so Aristotle says that, well, the function of reason, or the purpose of reason, is to know. That is to say, the purpose of reason, or its reason for being, is to know things, to acquire knowledge. That's what it's supposed to do. It's just supposed to know things. Will, on the other hand, has a main function of doing things. In other words, the purpose of will is to do things, to take action. Now, one important feature of this model is that Aristotle says that at all times, reason is to be followed. And that includes will. Will is certainly supposed to do things, and will is supposed to take action. But on the other hand, though, will is supposed to take that action that's prescribed to it by reason. Okay? And hopefully this will become a little bit more clear here in a little bit. Now, let's talk about how these two capacities might interact with one another. Okay? In going about our day and encountering things, this is the way reason and will might interact with one another. First of all, reason is engaged by what Aristotle might refer to as a first impulse. In other words, there's something that occurs or something that you encounter that signals reason that some form of action is necessary. And that's what we refer to here as a first impulse. Well, what happens in that particular case is reason recognizes that some kind of action must be taken. And reason then tells will that I've encountered some kind of an impulse and action needs to be taken here. At that point, will responds to reason and says, well, okay, that's fine. Okay, I believe you. Let's go ahead and act. And then reason then goes back to will and says, okay, well, here's what I know about this particular situation. Here's what I know about this action that needs to be taken. Here are the different things that are involved. Here are the different options for us. And here is what I believe to be the best action. And then, of course, through that interchange, will then says, okay, well, I must follow you, reason, and I believe that this action that you're telling me is the best, truly is the best, therefore we must do what is best. And the action is then taken. But there is yet a third capacity here that we need to talk about, and a human capacity, and that is the passions. Now the passions here, Aristotle tells us, are desires, wants, needs, emotions. And the passions can influence the operation of reason and will. And what we're going to be seeing is that they have a particular way of doing that. The main reason how they do that is by influencing reason. And Aristotle says that, well, how they do that is this. The passions, Aristotle says, influence reason by coloring its judgment of the good. In other words, what Aristotle says is that how the passions work on us is that something that we know to be not good for us is made to look good to us because of the influence of the passions. So for example, let's say that I'm confronted with a situation where a friend of mine does something that I'm not happy with. And because of that, I get angry. Well, anger is certainly a passion. It's an emotion, right? And because of that, that passion then might tell reason that, well, you might normally believe, or you might think that the best course of action here is to not say anything to your friend. That you might say something awful, or that you might hurt him, and therefore the best course of action is just not to say anything. The way the passions work, though, is that the passions may color the judgment of reason. So ordinarily, I might not say something to my friend if he makes me angry. But under the influence of the passions, remember that what I know to be bad is suddenly made to seem good. So under the passion of anger, I could suddenly lash out at my friend and call him names and get angry right back at him. And I would be doing that because my passions then would be telling reason that, well, getting mad and getting angry with your friend really is the best course of action. And of course that then gets offered to the will, and because the will must do what reason tells it, well then will then has me get angry with my friend. And so that's the way the passions are envisioned to work here. So we have the passions influencing reason, and then having that influence then being carried out by the will. And that's how the passions work their magic. And so very shortly, when we start talking about different philosophers here, we're going to find out that a number of them believed that reason must be followed, that we must control the will and that we must control our passions. And this is what they're referring to here, okay? This really does become the basis for much of deontological moral philosophy. The whole idea that there is reason, there is will, there is passions, and all three of these distinctly human capacities interact with one another, okay? So, to sum up this model that we've been talking about, at all times, reason must be followed. Okay? At all times, we must be reasonable. Okay? And that's what I referred to earlier in talking about deontology, is that at all times, we must do what's reasonable. Well, that's what reasonable means, that reason is being followed. Reason is king here, because that which is reasonable is good. Okay? We can control our passions by, Aristotle says, making them reasonable. Well, very shortly we're going to be talking about Aquinas here, who is one of my favorites. And it's Aquinas who wrote that the passions must be made reasonable by participation. In other words, what Aquinas says is that the passions must be made to participate in reason rather than directing reason. And so that's the way we control our passions, by making them reasonable. And of course, throughout this, we need to keep in mind here that passions need not be bad. I mean, the picture that we've been painting here is that the passions are unsavory, they're undesirable, they're something that needs to be controlled. And yes, they certainly do need to be controlled. They do need to be made reasonable, as Aristotle says. But they're not bad per se. I mean, for example, we have love, right? And it's hard to say that, well, love is bad. But on the other hand, though, in the grips of love, we can be led to do bad. We can be led to do bad things. I was hoping I'd get that out eventually. Again, the whole idea here is that passions need to be subjected to the light of reason. Okay? So that's our model of will, reason, and the passions. Okay? Which brings us to Aristotle. Okay, now we've already talked a lot about Aristotle here. And of course, one key feature of his moral philosophy is reason, will, and passions, and how they interplay with one another. But there are some other features of his take on moral philosophy that we need to talk about. One of them is the whole idea of the golden mean. Now, don't get that confused with the golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The golden mean, on the other hand, is about this. Aristotle says that in some circumstances, when we're faced with an action, there are extremes in terms of options that we have. Okay. So for example, going back to my friend saying something to me and making me angry, one option would have been to say nothing, right? Another option would have been to lash out at him and get angry right back at him. Well, these would be what Aristotle refers to as the extremes in a particular situation. And so what the golden mean refers to then is the whole idea that when faced with these two extremes, moral goodness can be had in the mean between the extremes. In other words, when we're faced with extremes in a particular action, goodness can often be determined by identifying the mean between the extremes. So again, in dealing with that example between me and my friend, we could look at that and say, well, one extreme would be to say nothing. The other extreme would be to get mad at him. The mean between those two extremes would be perhaps to just nicely say to him, well, that was hurtful. You hurt me. I didn't care for that. And so that would be an example of the golden mean at work. Okay. Well, that might sound good, and it's a very clean and simple approach to discovering what's right and wrong, but it does have one problem, and that problem here is that in some situations there is really no mean. Okay. Now, very shortly we're going to be applying Aristotle here to what we saw take place in the movie The Insider. And if you think about what happened in The Insider and the scene in Mississippi when Wygan is standing there with Bergman and Richard Scruggs and trying to decide if he was going to serve as a witness in Mississippi at their legal proceedings, Wygan was certainly faced with two extremes, right? I mean, on the one hand, he could certainly go and do the deposition, go to court and do it, right? I mean, that would be one extreme. The other extreme would be, deciding that he doesn't want to do it, hop back in the plane and go back to Louisville and do nothing, right? Well, in that particular case, what's the extreme? Well, the short answer to that is that, there really is no mean, I should say. There really is no mean between those two extremes, right? I mean, what is he supposed to do? Write a note on what he was going to say in court? No, there really isn't a mean in that particular situation. So Aristotle is careful to recognize that. And what he tells us is that sometimes it is completely acceptable to gravitate to an extreme in making a decision, because sometimes it is in fact necessary. So sometimes finding the golden mean is all about finding the right extreme. Okay? And so that's really the key thing here for Aristotle, is that he would tell us that sometimes there is no mean in a situation, and that's perfectly fine. But on the other hand, though, what we need to do in that particular case is to identify the correct extreme. And of course, to do that, we need to use our power of reason. Okay? Reason is the most important thing we need to do in that particular case, or the most important thing we need to use in that particular case in order to identify the appropriate extreme. Okay? So that's Aristotle. Okay? And he's our first deontologist that we'll be taking a look at today. The next is St. Thomas Aquinas, who was an Aristotelian, so to speak. In other words, he was a follower of Aristotle. And so he subscribed to Aristotle's moral theory in terms of there being a will and there being a reason and there being passions, and that ethics is all about controlling passions and doing what is reasonable. Okay, so he certainly followed all of that. Okay, but what he does, though, beyond that, is he adds a little bit of meat to that by giving the operation of reason some additional guidelines in the form of the virtues. Now, Aristotle talked about virtues too, but I want to say that it was Aquinas who really attached them firmly to reason and will and the passions. So, for example, we have the virtue of prudence. Okay, and we can define prudence as being the ability to determine the reasonable course of action in any particular situation. Okay, and so for that reason, prudence, Aquinas says, is to be thought of as a virtue of reason. Okay, so when we make a prudent decision, we are really perfecting the operation of reason. In other words, when we make a prudent decision, we're allowing reason to do exactly what it's supposed to do, which means we're perfecting reason. Okay. Another virtue that we have here is courage. Okay. Now, we can talk about courage as there is maintaining a particular course of action even when we're faced with something that is unpleasant. Okay. And so because of that, Aquinas says that courage is a virtue of the passions. Okay. That if we maintain a certain course of action in the face of something that is unpleasant, we're demonstrating courage, and therefore we are controlling our passions by pursuing a course of unpleasant action. Similarly, we have temperance. Now, like courage, temperance is also thought of by Aquinas to be a virtue of the passions. And temperance is maintaining a course of action, not when you're faced with something unpleasant, but on the other hand, temperance is maintaining a certain course of action when you're faced with something that is pleasant. And so that's why Aquinas believes that temperance is a virtue of the passions. And that is that if we're able to maintain a course of action that reason tells us is good, even when we're faced with something that is pleasant, that might distract us, that is thought to be a virtue of the passions. Finally, we have justice. Now, interestingly, Aquinas sees justice as being a virtue of the will, in that justice is what a contemporary philosopher, Jean Porter from the University of Notre Dame, has referred to as the standing orientation to give one another their proper due. Okay, and so for that reason, that's why Aquinas sees justice as being a virtue of the will, in that, if we are always cognizant that there are other people who also have their means and ends, their own desires, their own ambitions, their own needs, if we're cognizant of these people, if we're always cognizant of these people, then we will always give them their due. And that's why Aquinas sees justice as being a virtue of the will. And so again, in sum, Aquinas follows Aristotle in believing reason, will, and passions and their interplay, and that the passions must be brought under control or made reasonable. But he adds to the conversation the influence of the virtues. Next, we have Sir Francis Bacon, who is very much an Aristotelian. Okay. In other words, Bacon sees that there's reason, there's will, there are passions that need to be controlled, and he follows that model very, very closely. Okay. And so for that reason, we can think of Bacon solidly in the camp of Aristotle in saying that passions need to be controlled. Okay. Next, we have Thomas Hobbes. Now, Hobbes is most certainly a deontologist. But unlike some of the other philosophers who we're looking at here today, doesn't necessarily follow Aristotle and the model of reason and will and passions that closely. In a number of cases and a number of times, Hobbes was actually pretty critical of Aristotle's account of reason. But he does end up, in some cases, making some reference to it. Now, you might be wondering then in that case, well, then why is Hobbes a deontologist? Well, the main reason why Hobbes is a deontologist is because he envisions some things being inherently good and some things being inherently bad, not necessarily by virtue of the operation of reason, but instead by the recognition that we have obligations to attend to. So in that sense, Hobbes really is looked at as being the father of duty-based ethics. So the main reason that Hobbes is a deontologist is because he feels that we have certain duties and obligations to one another as members of society, and also probably to ourselves. Okay? And so by recognizing what duties or obligations we have to perform, we do good things. And when we perform actions that are involved in meeting our duties or accomplishing our duties or fulfilling our obligations, well, then we're doing what's morally right. Okay. Now, this might sound pretty straightforward, and it might sound pretty simple, and elegantly simple, really, as a moral philosophy. But if you give it some thought, there is one central problem with it, and that is this. There are some situations we're faced with that have competing obligations. Okay? And so we may be faced with making a certain decision, and we might recognize, well, okay, we have an obligation to this person here, or we have an obligation to that person there. What obligation is most important? Well, for that, Hobbes has recourse to reason. And Hobbes would say that, well, in that particular case, when we're faced with competing obligations or competing duties, we need to use our power of reason to be able to sort out what is the most compelling obligation, what is the most important duty, and why, and to then fulfill that particular duty or obligation. Okay. So the whole idea here of duties and obligations is something that appears quite often in media ethics, as we're going to see, where reporters have certain obligations and duties to do things, where journalists have duties and obligations, and where people who work in the persuasion industries of advertising and PR have obligations and duties, and also people who are in information systems and computing. They certainly have duties and obligations. And you could look at it too and say, well, you have duties and obligations as a student of the university and as a son or a daughter, so on and so forth. Okay. So that's Thomas Hobbes. Finally, today we have Francois Marie Arouet, or Voltaire for short. Voltaire was very much an Aristotelian, where he believed that reason and will and passions interact with one another, and that at all times we are to do what is reasonable. Reason must be followed. And so you can think of him on the line of Aristotle. Okay. And so what we've seen today with deontology really is one main or two main theories really. Those being, first of all, the whole idea of there being reason and will and passions, and they interact with one another. And secondly, the main moral theory of there being duties and obligations, or duty-based ethics. Those are the two main theories that we took a look at today in our look at deontology. Okay. And of course, what we saw there is Aquinas adding to that first theory by talking about the virtues, and Thomas Hobbes talking specifically about duties and obligations as the basis for moral action. And what we saw is Voltaire and Bacon more or less following along with Aristotle. Okay. So that's our look at deontology for today. And again, remember, deontology here is the school of moral philosophy that believes that there are some things that are inherently good, there are some things that are inherently bad, and we can identify those things that are inherently good by using our capacity of reason. Okay, and as we're going to see, that's going to be in direct opposition to teleological philosophy, which is going to take a look at good and bad based on the actions that come about, or I should say the consequences that come about from actions. So we'll be taking a look at teleology tomorrow. Thanks for listening.